The book of Esther. Did you enjoy reading it? What a great and amazing story. Before we start, you obviously notice that the word God never occurs anywhere in the book, and he's not referenced. No one prays. He doesn't. There's nothing like the word of the Lord came to so-and-so. It's very interesting because even as you read the story, and as we go through it tonight, there's clear marks where God obviously is working. And I think that there's a point in the way this author records the event so that we'll realize whether you acknowledge it or are aware of it or not, God is superintending in the circumstances. And it's true in their lives, it's true then, it's true for the Jewish people, but it's also true for all of us. We find that God's working in our lives whether we acknowledge him or not. I remember after I got saved, I grew up as a total heathen. I never prayed, I never thought about God, I never, really sought after God or wondered. Maybe a few moments in my life for a short time, maybe, I don't know, a few minutes. But I know that after I got saved, I could look back, even when I was an unbeliever, and think, man, God worked in this moment and kept me from this, and God worked in this moment. And even times where I remember having a thought of not doing something, and God was literally protecting me from something. And I realized after the fact, I think God was actually speaking to me. So I think the book of Esther is meant to be an encouragement like that for us. And also an encouragement that God can work no matter how wicked the days are or how dysfunctional the time is, which is especially important for us as we're living in ourselves in very wicked times, very confusing times, and challenging times, that God's still at work. He's at work in all of our lives and wherever we're at. Like Esther, God has worked in our lives and put us into certain places, and he's doing a certain thing. We may not realize that we need to be open. So it's a very, very important book. So chapter 1 tells us the story of, that kind of sets the tone for what's happening. They're in Persia. Ahasuerus is king. And notice verse 1, it says that the Persian Empire stretches from India to Ethiopia. That's amazing. They've gone as far east as India. They've covered the whole Fertile Crescent. They've gone and they go all the way down through Egypt. They control Egypt. And then the empire spreads all the way into Asia Minor. So really the known world. And he's the king, and he's having this massive feast, and the feast is for 6 months. 180 days, verse 4 says, of partying. So when you're a king of the world, you don't just party for the weekend, you party for half a year. So it's a 6-month-long, just crazy celebration. And then when that feast is completed, verse 5 says that then there's another feast, specifically 7 days for the government officials that are at the palace in Shushan, in the citadel. And they're celebrating there. All different kinds of alcohol is being served. But verse 9 tells us the men and women are separated. Queen Vashti has given a feast for the women in the royal palace, and all the men are in another place. And this introduces the conflict that's going to happen in the story that brings Esther into the palace, which is probably as blatant of an example of sexism and misogyny as you could find. And again, this is not given to us in the Bible as though sanctioning this or recommending this. These are pagans. They're Persians. And this isn't against Persians, by the way, if you're a Persian here and you're here. We're not discriminating against you. This is essentially all men everywhere when they have power. Men will objectify women, and sexism seems to be something that goes back to the fall. It's part of the consequences that God warned humanity about. And so the men and women are separate. And now they're drunk and partying, and the king gets the idea in verse 10. It says the heart of the king was merry with wine, which means he's under the influence of alcohol. And he gets the idea, verse 11, to bring in the queen in order to show her beauty to the people and the officials. So his wife is now being presented as an object before a group of drunken men. I want to bring her in, and I want them to be able to check out my wife, which is a disgusting thing to imagine. And yet that's the reality of it. The sexism here, there's no way around it. The word misogyny just describes a male failure really to love unconditionally women, or to treat a woman like a sister, or to prefer a woman, or to honor a woman. She's not being honored by this. This is not something that's bringing honor to her. It's bringing shame to her. Yet he's doing it. The objectifying of women by men, the sexual exploitation of women by men. And today we have the same problems. We have a Me Too movement in our country where we have powerful men objectifying women, using their positions of power to take advantage of them. And it doesn't matter which political party, because we had a sitting president, taking advantage of, in the White House, a 24-year-old. I have a 24-year-old daughter. I can't imagine if my 24-year-old daughter had excelled to the point where she was accepted into a program to be an intern at the White House, and then to have a predatory, evil man take advantage of her for sexual purposes and use his position of power to take advantage of her, as President Clinton did. And I was talking with my son today at lunch, and he said he was just recently, he's a doctor, and he was recently in a conversation, and they were talking about, or he was listening to someone talk about these issues, and that scandal is called the Monica Lewinsky scandal. Why isn't it called the Bill Clinton scandal? Do you ever think of that? You know, she was concerned about maybe having to change her name. How come he wasn't concerned about having to change his name? It's her scandal, not his scandal. What an example what a corruption, but it's not exclusive to any particular group of people. Saudi Arabia, you think it's better there for a woman than it is here? How about India? How about China? How about Serbia? How about, pick a place. That's human nature, and it's evil, and it's wrong. It's wrong in our culture, and it's wrong especially in the believers. A place where women should be honored and what's the right word? The differences celebrated and encouraged, and women encouraged would be within the church, and so this is something that's very tragic in the story. It sort of sets the pace, because verse 12, Queen Vashti is appalled at this. Verse 12 says she refuses to come at the king's command, and I say, God bless her for that. I'm not going to walk into this room with a bunch of drunken men and have them ogle me. No, I'm not. No, I'm not going in. And so she refuses. But you'll see now the backlash now from the male-dominated culture as the king becomes furious, filled with anger, and so he talks to his wise men and what should we do? And the guys that are close to him, and verse 16. This one guy says, she's not only wronged the king, but all the princes and all the people who are in all the provinces. And notice what he's afraid of, verse 17. The queen's behavior will become known to all women, so that they will despise their husbands in their eyes when they report, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought in, but she didn't come. Like, this is going to cause like a women's liberation movement. We can't have that. We can't have these ladies thinking they can say no to their husbands. So you got to do something about this. So let's get rid of her. You should kick her out, make a law, verse 19, and get rid of her and get someone else. And so she's really being treated like property. She's replaceable. She has no value. We're already separated, and she's now disrespected you. And so now in his anger, he's very frustrated, and so you need to do this. So all the guys, all the men are there. They're like, hey, that's a great idea. Let's do it. So they do it. Let's keep the women down. There's something within the culture that says you speak up, you move outside of what the social norms are for a woman. We're not going to allow this. Still, it's in America today. Still exists here. And notice verse 1 of chapter 2, though. And here's another interesting insight. This is also directly applicable to us as men. After these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus subsided, he remembered Vashti, what she had done, and what had been decreed against her. So what happens? Here's a man overreacting in anger, creating a whole set of circumstances that once he calms down, he realizes what an idiot he was. I talked to husbands like that over the years many, many, many times. I don't know. Maybe I could probably count on one hand the times I've talked to a woman that this probably would have described. Less than on one hand in 20, let's say the whole time I've been a Christian, over 30 years of serving the Lord, talking to married couples, I would say probably less than on one hand the times I've talked to a woman where this would describe a woman, that in her anger she overreacted and created consequence. I can't tell you how many men that this would describe them. That a man in his anger and in his pride overreacted to a situation and then regretted it shortly thereafter. So sad. But it's just the flesh. This is what the flesh looks like. And so then they've got another genius idea. And no, this is evil. This isn't right. This isn't set forth to us as an example to follow. It's something we would read and way, this is very tragic. And so then the conclusion is verse 2, you're sad, let's get a new girl. Let's find beautiful young virgins. How old is this king, do you think? We need to replace this woman, and so let's find some young, beautiful woman. And so they do basically a beauty contest, and the king says, okay, that sounds great. I'll get somebody else. Now, we learn in verse 5 that there's a certain Jew named Mordecai. He'd been brought into the captivity. In verse 7, he'd brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter. Some of these words are interchangeable. It could be a brother or an uncle. She's a near relative to his, and she didn't have a father or mother. She becomes like his daughter. He treats her like his own daughter, verse 7 says. And now verse 8, when the king's command and decree were heard, and when many young women were gathered together at the palace, that Esther also was taken to the king's palace into the care of Hegai, the custodian of the women. Taken to the palace. I don't think she volunteered for this. In some way, you could say, well, look, she's a refugee. She's going to be elevated. She's got an opportunity to move up her station in life. She's being moved from one place to another, not of her own free will, for the purpose of sexploitation. What's that called? It's called human trafficking. It's called sex trafficking. She's because these guys have power. They're all these gals. Every beautiful woman they can find, they all bring them in there to be part of the harem, to be sort of, hey, we'll just see how this works out, which is a horrible, horrible thing. All of this is, you'll see God's going to use this for good, but it's just none of this is good in and of itself. And so she's there. God protected her, verse 9. She's given favor, the servant there. He gives her one of the best places. He really has a heart for her. She doesn't reveal that she's Jewish, verse 10. But notice verse 11, to see that I'm not making this up. How does Mordecai think about this? Every day Mordecai paced in front of the court of the women's quarters to learn of Esther's welfare and what was happening to her. What's going on in his heart? He can't leave the palace. He knows the building that she's in, and he's out in front. Anybody that comes out or anybody that's going in, hey, can you check it out? Find out. She's like a daughter to me. She's in there. They picked her up. Like, can you bring me back news? Ask her how she's doing. Like, is she okay? And he's in great turmoil over this, and rightly so. But we see here as they go through the beauty treatments and all, and they're going to be brought in before the king, and then he's going to decide if he wants to have a relationship with them or whatever. Her turn comes, and she's brought in, and everybody saw her. She was very beautiful. In verse 17, we read, the king loved Esther more than everyone else, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, and so he set the royal crown upon her head, and he made her queen instead of Vashti. Now, again, this is one of those things like, well, she's made queen. Well, how was Vashti treated as queen? Was she an equal? No, the men and women are separated. She's going to be objectified. Does she have a voice? Can she say anything? Can she object? No, she can't. She'll be deposed. Essentially just a trophy for a symbol of his conquest or whatever. So now Esther's in this place. And they have a great feast. They're going to, honor her. And again, it's emphasized in verse 20. She hasn't told anybody that she's Jewish. And the last part of the chapter tells us one more thing. So the first part of God's providence is she's promoted into this position. Second part, verse 21, in those days Mordecai was sitting within the king's gate. Two of the king's eunuchs, these guys, they're doorkeepers, they became furious, and they were going to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So there's a plot against the king. The matter became known to Mordecai, who then told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. And an inquiry was made into the matter. It was confirmed, and then both were hanged on a gallows, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles of the presence of the king. So that sets the stage for something will happen later. So we're just looking at unbelievers acting like unbelievers. 6 months of Mardi Gras, 6 months of being at Amsterdam and just getting loaded and getting high, just partying for 6 months. Then a special week-long celebration, the dysfunction of the marriages, the degradation of relationships, objectifying of women. A woman says, no, I'm not going to do that. She's kicked out. Let's have a beauty contest and bring me some new hot young chick and make her. But now we've got this person who's one of God's people is now brought into the story, and all of that, what that means. But we read she actually is given the position of being queen, and then Mordecai happens to hear about a plot against the king, and then tells Esther. She's right there in the palace, makes it known to the king. They actually investigate, find out the guys were traitors. They're judged, and it's written in the record that Mordecai is the one who brought the news. So we're moving along in the story. But it's not a good story so far. It's a sad story, and it's a tragic story, and it's going to get way, way worse. One of the things Randy told me that they do in Israel, because when they celebrate Purim, before we get done, we'll see the whole chapter on the celebration. When they celebrate this, he said, usually the believers will gather together and they read the book. And every time you hear the word Mordecai, everyone goes, yay! And every time you hear the word Haman, the name of Haman, everyone goes, boo, boo. So, I mean, we're not really a big amening church, and normally I don't encourage booing, but I don't really like this Haman fellow. So if you feel so led, this will be the one exception. No booing any other time. And no cricket ringtones either, by the way. Whoever that was a couple years ago, remember that last year? Cricket ringtone was wonderful. It's great for the pastor's ego. So now we introduced in chapter 3 to this guy Haman, and I heard a couple boos. That was nice. Thank you. So then he's a big shot, and we're told in verse 1 he's an Agagite, which also connects him with a larger story, because King Saul was told by God that at that point God was going to judge the Amalekites for something the Amalekites had done centuries earlier. When Israel was coming out of Egypt, they were vulnerable. The Amalekites were a nomadic group of people, and they attacked Israel where the elderly and where the children were, and to take advantage of them. And God pronounced a judgment and a curse on Amalek and said he would wipe them out. Well, then comes along King Saul many, many years later, and God now tells Saul, now's the time I'm going to judge the Amalekites. And Saul did not complete the task. And who did he save alive? The king, Agag, which some people speculate the title Agag actually, or is not a name, but actually a title of a king of the Amalekites. So if that is the case, this Haman is claiming to be descended from Amalek, from the royalty of Amalek. In either case, very interesting that he's called from Agag, because we know who that is in the Bible. And so Saul's incomplete obedience, and it's an Amalekite that brings the news to David, who claims to have killed Saul, and now here it's an Agagite who is later wanting to commit genocide against Israel. So if you've got something going on in your life and God's telling you to get rid of it, remember Saul. Get rid of it, because if you don't get rid of it, it will come back, and we need to be obedient to what God tells us to do. So this fellow, Haman, he wants to be a big shot, and everyone's bowing down to him, and Mordecai, verse 2, will not bow down or pay homage. The guy wants to be worshipped, essentially. And when Mordecai won't, this guy becomes so incensed, and he finds out that Mordecai is a Jew, verse 4 says. And when he finds out he's a Jew and he won't bow down, verse 6, he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. They told him of the people of Mordecai, and so instead Haman sought to destroy all the Jews throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. Remember, from India all the way to Ethiopia? That's the known world. Anywhere there's a Jew in the Persian Empire, This guy won't bow down to me, and I'm such a big shot. I'm not just going to kill him. I'm going to kill everybody from his tribe. I'll kill them all. This is a megalomaniac bent on destroying the Jewish people. Is he the only one in history who's a megalomaniac bent on destroying the Jewish people because of his crazy satanic pride? No, there's others. And this guy has this as his plan. So he wants to commit genocide, and this demonically inspired hatred of God's people comes from the devil. Anti-Semitism comes from the devil. Of course, all the other whatever the race, anytime someone hates an entire group of people, that's from the devil. The thief comes to steal and kill and destroy. That's the devil. He hates everybody, but he especially hates the Jews because of God's promises to them. So this Haman decides, I'm going to get these guys. And this is where the name Purim comes from. In verse 7, the feast is called Purim because Pur, that is the lot, verse 7 says. So they decide, when are we going to do this? And they cast lots. They cast the Pur, that is the lot, before Haman to determine the day and the month. And they pick the month Adar. So they've got the date. We're going to get this guy. And so he goes to the king and he suggests to the king, there are these people, they're kind of different than everybody. They're troublemakers. And I will give you, verse 9, I will give you 10,000 talents of silver. Primarily, the genocide is motivated by greed, by money. It's interesting. You'll hear people say, and if you're a college student or you're still a high school student, you're going to go to college, let me remind you that when you're in school and someone says, you know, it's so many wars are by religion, raise your hand and say, actually, I think I disagree with you. More wars are about money. If you want to blame a god, you blame the love of money. Because most wars are about money. And here, this is really primarily about money. And the king thinks, well, 10,000 talents. One of the commentaries I read said that according to one of the historians, that the annual income, I thought he said, was like 15,000 talents. So to offer 10,000 talents is to like almost equal it's like 2/3 of the GDP for the Persian Empire. So Haman was very rich, or thinking we'll get the spoils from these Jews. They've got money. And so this is going to be a big windfall. We're going to take all that they have when we wipe them all out. So the king says, yeah, okay, let's do it. And so they make the plan, and then they make a decree and send the decree out. I'm assuming you read this. I don't want to read through the details of it. The plan is they send out the letters on a certain day, verse 13, we're going to kill and annihilate all the Jews. So sad. Young, old, little children, women, on one day, and the 13th day of the 12th month, the month Adar. Remember, they cast the lots, and we're going to plunder their possessions. So they're appealing to the people, a racial difference. They're going to promote the fact that the Jewish people didn't really melt in with everybody else. They've got their own unique culture. They're holding on to it. We don't really know what they're about anyways. They seem to be accumulating money. We should get them. And isn't it interesting, there's still an anti-Semitism today of Jewish money. There's nothing new under the sun. This is 2,400 years old, this document that we're reading. Esther is 2,400 plus years ago. And here it is. Now, these guys have money. We should kill them all. So they send this document out, and everybody's, the whole city of Shushan is perplexed. It's sort of an overwhelming thing to have a genocide all on one day. Mordecai learns about it, chapter 4, and he begins to mourn. He's weeping. He puts on sackcloth, and he's fasting, he's wailing, he has ashes on. And Esther hears about it, and she doesn't understand. And verse 4, she's deeply distressed, and she sends garments to clothe Mordecai. He's laying in the ashes and howling. So she sends him some royal clothes, give him some new stuff. I don't know what's happening. And then Mordecai really begins to exhort her in chapter 4. He won't receive the gift from her, and he's just out there, he's weeping, and so he sends a message to her saying, listen, verse 8, go in and explain to the king and make supplication for your people. And she sends a message back to him, verse 11. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that any man or woman who goes into the inner court of the king who has not been called has but one law, put to death, except one exception would be to him or to whom the king holds out the golden scepter that he may live. And I've not been called to go into the king for these 30 days. So he said, you need to go see the king, and you need to tell him what's happening. And she said, I can't. The law is, if you're not invited, you don't go into the king. They'll kill you. I mean, there's an executioner right there, ready. If you come in without an appointment, you're done. And the one exception that the king could intervene, but you're dead. And Mordecai now says what's become the immortal exhortation. It's such a profound statement. It starts in verse 13. He says, do you think in your heart that you'll escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews? If you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. So the first point he makes is God's going to deliver his people. God doesn't need you. God can do it. God will do it. He's going to deliver his people if you don't do it. But you and your father's house will perish. And then he says this, yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Now we're tying together the earlier part of the story. You're in the palace, Esther. We've gone through this tremendous difficulty, very traumatic experience. You were taken from your home. You were put into the palace. You're in the harem of the king. It's wicked. The queen had been deposed just for pure male, chauvinism in the grossest way. And now you're there. Like maybe God knew all of this. Like he doesn't mention God, but maybe this is an opportunity. Maybe now this is why this happened. You can do something about this. He exhorts her. And she responds in verse 16 by asking for prayer. Go gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan and fast for me, and don't eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. And my maids and I will fast, and then I will go to the king, which is against the law. I'll do it. And then she says this. Here's her immortal words at the end of verse 16. If I perish, I perish. It's like, all right, you're right. Who knows? And what we see, this story is told like a story, and it is a story, but it's not a storybook story. It's a true story. And it's told in such a way as to keep the focus on the bigger picture. There's a lot of things we could think about looking at the story, but the primary point of the story is God's working, and we don't really know what God's doing. God hasn't been mentioned. We're not quoting him speaking to somebody. We're not really seeing people pray. We see Daniel praying all the time. Nehemiah was praying every other verse practically in the book of Nehemiah. This story is told very differently, and that is these people are living in a very difficult time, but God's working in all the circumstances, and who knows but that you're right exactly where you're supposed to be. Isn't that amazing to think about? That you'll be right in the right place at the right time. And that's true of our lives, isn't it? So many things in our lives, it just so happened. Just so happened. Just so happened that this happened. Just so happened that that happened. And her response is, all right, it looks like this is what the Lord wants to do. And so I'll go for it. I don't know, though. The uncertainty of it, that was the focus of the message this morning. If you weren't here this morning, I'd encourage you to get a copy of that or listen online. I think that the insight here of Mordecai saying, who knows? Who knows? There's no certainty in this. And she doesn't have certainty. Well, if I die, I die. My course is certain. I need to do this. But what's going to happen? I don't know. How much of our lives is, I know what I'm supposed to do, I'm just going to do it, and I'm not sure what's going to happen. But I know the right thing that I'm supposed to do. And if you in your life can learn how to live with that uncertainty and do what you're supposed to do, even when you're not certain how it's going to turn out, you've learned a tremendous lesson, a very, very important lesson that will make you fruitful in your life. If you can say, I don't know what will happen in my marriage, but this is what I need to do. I don't know what's going to happen at work, but I got to do this. This is what the Lord wants me to do. And it might be short-term painful because there's no certainty in it, right? If I perish, I perish. But surrender is always the way to go. So she goes for it, and then they are fasting. Everyone's, the people are seeking the Lord for 3 days. And so on the third day, verse 1 of chapter 5, she comes before the king. She goes for it. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes, and she stood in the inner court of the king's palace across from the king's house, while the king sat on his royal throne in the royal house, facing the entrance of the house. She's like, I'm doing it. So she does. And so verse 2, it was when the king saw Queen Esther. Imagine her heart. Have you ever stepped out in obedience and thought, this is where I die, this is where I die, hey, I didn't die. I haven't died yet. I mean, I suppose one of these times I will, but it hasn't happened yet. But here she is. She's standing in the court, and verse 2, she found favor in his sight. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand, and she went near and touched the top of the scepter. And the king said, what do you wish, Queen Esther? Now that's open door. Now the story's changing. Who knows? But for such a time as this is a very unique time, Esther. Maybe the Lord wants to use you. What do you want, Esther? What is your request? It will be given to you up to half the kingdom. So here's what she says. And this is interesting. I don't know what to make of I don't know the application. Kind of reminds me of Gideon, who is kind of like a teenager learning to drive a stick shift, right? Where it's, you're like, come on now, stall. Put it back in neutral. Put your foot in the clutch. Let's start it back up. Okay, put it in gear. So, what do you want? I mean, it's open door, right? So she says, you ready for it? It's going to be the big reveal. Verse 4, if it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a banquet that I prepared. All right, it's close. We're moving. The ball's rolling. I'm not sure where it's rolling, but okay, Haman and the king are going to come. Let's have a banquet. Oh, okay. You came in and risked your neck to invite me to a picnic. Okay. So the king said, well, all right, verse 5. Get Haman. Let's have a banquet. Esther's prepared a banquet. So then they come to the banquet. Verse 6. And the king says to Esther, well, what's your petition? It's going to be granted to you. What's your request? Up to half the kingdom. It will be done. So here's the big reveal. Remember I said it's a teenager learning to drive a stick? Maybe you can remember when you learned to drive a stick. Verse 8. Well, if I've found favor in the sight of the king, if it please the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the banquet that I prepared for them tomorrow. And I'll let you know what I want to tell you. Like, okay. All right. Well, this is interesting. I mean, the king seems kind of an interesting character in this. Okay, let's do it. So Haman, this is where the story unravels for him rather quickly. Haman goes out with, joyful heart. He's just, wow, the queen's inviting me. He saw Mordecai there. Mordecai won't bow down, and he just flips his lid. And he doesn't kill him, right? He's just on the spot. He's just so mad. So he goes back. Look at verse 11, his pride. He calls his friends and his wife. Everyone's there, and he tells them how rich he is and how many kids he has, and everything in which the king's promoted him, and how he's advanced him above all the officials and servants of the king. This guy is number 2 in a world-dominating empire from India to Ethiopia, and he's the number 2 guy. He is a big shot, full of himself, very wealthy. And he said, besides all this, Queen Esther invited me to come to a banquet, and I'm the only one that's been invited. But verse 13, but I see this Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. Man, that guy, the guy's number 2 in the world, and he can't deal with Mordecai. He can't handle it. And so his wife gives him terrible advice, and his friends, verse 14, they say, let a gallows be made 50 cubits high. A cubit, that's roughly is a foot and a half. 50 cubits is how many feet then? 75 feet. You know how high this ceiling is? It's about 20, depends on which side you're at, but from the joist, it's like 20 something, like 21 feet, 22 feet. So triple plus 15 feet, the height of this room. 75-foot high gallows. It's pretty high. Put this guy up on a gallows and hang that dude where everybody can see him. Like you're a big shot. Hang your enemy in front of everybody so everybody can see it. And look at the last verse last sentence in verse 14, the end of chapter 5. The thing pleased Haman. That's a great idea. When you get captured by bitterness, and you're captured by pride, and you're captured by greed, You're captured by selfish ambition. You know, where the Bible says where there's jealousy and selfish ambition, there's disorder and every evil thing. This guy is blind. All he can think about, that'll be the greatest thing in the world is to hang that guy. And why is he hanging him? He's not properly respecting me. He doesn't recognize my glory. And so I want to hang that guy 75 feet in the air by his neck. So we get more God's providence. Chapter 6. That night the king couldn't sleep. So what do you do when you can't sleep? Some of you might be going through this. You might want to try King Ahasuerus' method. He commanded someone to bring the book of the records of the Chronicles. Bring me that history book. That thing puts me to sleep every time. A record book. So he's trying to sleep. Oh man, I can't fall asleep. And then Haman brought in, he's just going through these records, and all of a sudden they read the story. Verse 2. It was found written that Mordecai had told of these two guys, the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers, who were going to overthrow Ahasuerus. They happened to be reading in the part of the history. Think of all the history books that they could read. They grab the one that has Mordecai's part, and they start reading right where they get before he falls asleep, the part about Mordecai. And he hears the story, and he goes, hey, it doesn't say anything in there. Did we ever do anything for that guy? That guy saved my life. And there's no record of me rewarding him. So he asked, did we do anything for this guy? And they go, no one did. We didn't do anything for him. So, verse 4, then the king says, well, who's outside? Who's in the court? Who's on night duty out there? Well, they say, Haman just walked in. And he goes, great. He knows how to glorify people, essentially. And he was coming in, verse 4 says, notice, he was coming into the outer court of the king's palace to suggest that the king hang Mordecai on the gallows that he prepared for him. But right before he comes in, the king just so happens to be reading about how Mordecai saved his life and realizes we never honored the guy. How can I honor him? And this guy's coming in. How can I kill him? And Mordecai has no representative in the government except for Esther, but she can't come unless she's invited. Mordecai has no way to protect himself. This book is put in the Bible to encourage us that God's in control, even when it looks like he's not in control, that he's in control. He can be trusted. He can be trusted with the uncertainty. Be obedient. Be faithful to do what God says. When it's clear what God's telling you to do, you do it and trust him with the results because he is in control. We don't want to make this a platitude. Sometimes people are going through great difficulty, and when you're at the hospital bed and someone just got the diagnosis that their baby has some kind of terminal cancer, don't look at them and say, well, God's in control. The Bible says weep with those who weep. It's not always the most comforting thing when you yourself are being ground into dust by your tragedy to have somebody give you something. It can come across as being very uncompassionate. But it's true. God is in control. But it's not always the most encouraging thing to say to somebody as though you're not acknowledging what they've been through. We want to weep with those who weep, and we want to be able to bring people back to a place of realizing that God's in control with grace and gentleness and humility. And that always doesn't just happen by asserting to them that God's in control. Well, God's in control. It's like, yeah, watch, let's see if he stops my fist from hitting you in the mouth. Thanks for comforting me in my grief. So it is true that God's in control, but we want to lovingly, prayerfully, and with tears be with our friends when they're going through something and help walk them back, or if necessary, carry them back. Just get on my back. You don't have to worry about God being in control. I'll just carry you until God ministers to you and we can put your feet back on the ground. But that being said, God is in control. He is in control. It's actually true. And we want to just be careful, though, about how we minister to people. So, who's in the court? Well, you think, well, it's Haman. Well, what a coincidence. Haman came in, and before he can say, hey, the king says, what should we do? What should be done for someone that the king wants to honor? If we want to honor somebody, Haman, what should we do for him? And Haman thinks, who but me does the king want to honor? And notice what he says. Look at what his real designs are. Verse 8, let a royal robe be brought which the king has worn. Notice that. Whose robe? Let the guy wear the king's robe. And a horse on which the king has ridden. Whose horse? The king's robe and the king's horse. And has a royal crest placed on his head. Royal crest. Who has a royal crest placed on his head? The king. What position is Haman really after? He wants to be king. This is the danger with selfish ambition and pride. That's why James warns against it. Wherever jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there's disorder and every evil thing. He's warning the believers about it. We need to look at Haman and see ourselves and go, I want to be free from this. I'm not trying to take someone else's position. I'm going to surrender to the Lord. The Lord can do with my life whatever he wants to do. But Haman, what a warning. And he thinks this is talking about himself. And the king hears about that and he thinks, that's a great idea. Verse 10, hurry, take the robe and the horse, and as you've suggested, do so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits in the king's gate. Haman, probably his blood went cold. Leave nothing undone of all that you've spoken. Haman took the robe and the horse and arrayed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city and proclaimed, thus it shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. This is like a movie, right? Like you think, are you serious? And Mordecai went back to the king's gate, and Haman went to his house mourning with his head covered. And remember the great friends who were so supportive, his wife included. Verse 13, he told him everything, and his wife said, if that Mordecai before whom you've begun to fall is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him. Thanks, Captain Obvious. I mean, like a minute ago, who's the one who suggested you build a 75-foot gallows? The same group, right? The wife and the friends. Now they're like, you're dead. Remember the prodigal son story? It's a story. That's not a true story. It's a parable. This is a true story. But in the prodigal son parable, Jesus talks about the prodigal son who went out and he's partying, and then it says he ran out of money. And when he ran out of money, he ran out of friends. And he's feeding the pigs the food, and he wishes he could eat what the pigs were eating, and he doesn't have any friends. When you leave the Lord or you leave righteousness and you end up with a group of friends, they're going to be your friends as long as the money's flowing, as long as the party's going. But you got to be really careful about how many friends you really have if you don't have friends in the Lord. This is such a typical kind of a story. And so while he was still talking, then the eunuchs came, oh, you're coming to the banquet. And they come take him to the banquet. Remember banquet number 1 and then banquet number 2? We're now at banquet number 2. So chapter 7 then, on the next day, the second day then, they have the banquet. And so the king says to Esther, what's your petition? It's going to be granted to you. What's your request? He's probably getting excited, like, well, what's the deal? What do you want? Now she says it. Verse 3, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given at my petition and my people at my request. We've been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, to be annihilated. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss. And King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, who is he and where is he who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing? And Esther said, the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. So he just had paraded Mordecai, and then his family's like, it looks like it's not going good for you. And then he goes to the thing, and she says, this is the guy. The king becomes so angry, verse 7, he's got an anger problem. He goes out, he just walks out of the room in his anger. And Haman then begins to plead for his life. And the king comes back in, and verse 8 says, Haman had kind of dove across the couch where Esther was, is bowing before her, laying on the couch, touching her. And the king says in verse 8, will he also assault the queen while I'm in the house? And the word left the king's mouth. And notice, they covered Haman's face. The Persians, remember Esther said, if I come in and I'm not invited, they're going to take my head? Apparently this guy travels with bodyguards to the point where, is this going to happen? And guys put a bag over that dude's head, and he's taken that quick. And then one of the eunuchs said, verse 9, look, there's those gallows. Remember how high they were? They can see them. Look at it. There's gallows right there, 75 feet high. Haman had made those for Mordecai, who had spoke good on your behalf, and they're at his house. And the king said, that's a great place to hang him. So, verse 10, they hanged Haman on the gallows that he'd prepared for Mordecai. Now, this isn't a type. It's not a picture, but I would say it is. It's not a type in the true sense of a biblical type, but this is a tremendous example of what happened when Jesus Christ died on the cross. The very instrument that the devil created for the demise of the Son of God became the instrument that was the demise of the devil. Paul writes very clearly in Colossians that Jesus triumphed over the devil in his cross. The cross was perpetrated by the devil. The Bible says that Satan himself entered into Judas Iscariot, and Judas Iscariot, possessed by Satan himself, went to betray Jesus, took the money, brought the mob. They arrested Jesus. The plan, it seems to be the demonically inspired plan, is to have Jesus be crucified. Jesus, though, all along is going to the cross. The devil has a plan to destroy Jesus in the cross, and Jesus has a plan to destroy the devil in the cross. And the devil's destroyed in the cross. We sing the song, and they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony, and they didn't love their lives unto death. We overcome the devil by the blood of the Lamb, and the blood of the Lamb shared on the cross. Satan triumphed over the devil openly, publicly, made a spectacle of him in the cross. And so the very instrument that was meant to be for Jesus' destruction becomes the very instrument that's for the devil's destruction. I don't necessarily think that this is a type. I wouldn't call it maybe a type of that, but talk about a great parallel story to help you understand what God's done for us in the cross. This guy's hanging from the thing that he intended for the other guy. It became his destruction, and that's absolutely true of the devil. The cross is the end of the devil. But, this book is 10 chapters long, so we still have 3 more chapters. What's happening? Well, there's a day, Purim, right? They cast the lots on a certain day. This guy's plan is in action. They sent out letters all across the empire, from India all the way to Ethiopia. The messengers have gone out, kill the Jews day, and take all their stuff. It's going to happen. So that's the next part of the story. Then chapter 8 says Mordecai is promoted. And verse 2 takes the signet ring off from Haman, gives it to Mordecai, and said, why don't you just replace this guy? And then Esther intervenes now one more time. In verse 3, she speaks again to the king, fell down at his feet, implored him with tears to counteract the evil that Haman had devised against the Jews. He held the verse 4, he held the scepter towards her. She came and stood before the king and said, please, can you send letters to revoke these letters from Haman? How can I endure to see my people killed? And so that's the plan. From verse 7 all the way to the end of the chapter, basically the account of write the letter, seal it, send it out to spare the Jewish people. Tell them to defend themselves and that I'm the king, and I'm saying all the Jews. Verse 13, a copy of this document issued as a decree in every province published for all people, that the Jews will be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. So the first letter goes out, kill all the Jews on this day and take their stuff. Then another letter comes out, hey, if you try to kill all the Jews are going to kill you and take your stuff. You're like, oh, well, okay, well, maybe I won't kill anybody on that day. We'll just not do anything on that day. And that essentially kind of neutralizes it for the most part. The Jewish people, verse 16, they're rejoicing in that God's done that, and the king's command came, and they all had joy and gladness and a feast and a holiday, and many of the people of the land even became Jews, it says, because the fear of the Jews fell upon them. But we still are going to conclude the story in chapter 9. The first part of the story, on that day that came for this execution of the Jews, on that day the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, verse 1 says, but the opposite occurred. How many times has that happened, even till today? The enemies of the Jews thought they were going to destroy the Jews, and actually the Golan Heights was taken, and then Jerusalem is taken, and the Sinai is taken, and now they've got at least some kind of a buffer zone between these enemies that are bent on destroying them. So this is just supernatural intervention from God, and No one could withstand them. And verse 4, Mordecai became great in the king's palace. His fame was spreading throughout all the provinces. Verse 5, the Jews defeated all their enemies with the stroke of the sword. So some did try to attack them, even in Shushan the palace. 500 were killed. The news came that this had taken place. And so verse 13, Esther said, if it pleases the king, let it be granted to the Jews who are in Shushan to do again tomorrow, according to today's decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows. And so the king issued that command, and they hanged Haman's sons. And the Jews in Shushan then gathered together on the 14th day of the month Adar, and then killed 300 more in Shushan, but they didn't lay a hand on the plunder. So all those that were anti-Semitic, they were all judged. And then the remainder of the Jews protected themselves. In verse 16, it wasn't a very large battle. There were 75,000. It's large, but it's not what it could have been. And in those battles, they defeated their enemies, but they didn't take the plunder. And they rested then and had a day of feasting and gladness. And verse 18, then we learn about the institution of this festival called Purim. So Mordecai wrote letters to everybody. In verse 19, they all celebrated that day with gladness and feasting as a holiday, and they sent presents to one another. Mordecai, then verse 20, wrote letters to everybody that they would establish them to celebrate annually, yearly, on the 14th and 15th days of the month Adar, as those days that the Jews had rest from their enemies, to make it into a holiday, to turn from sorrow to joy and from mourning to a holiday, and that they would have a day of feasting and joy and send presents to one another and gifts to the poor. So they began to celebrate that day and called it Purim. And the Jews established themselves. God delivered them. And Queen Esther sent letters, a second letter about Purim, verse 30. Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews. So it's really the establishing of Purim by Esther and Mordecai, and then chapter 10 finishes with the blessing upon Mordecai. King Ahasuerus imposed tribute on the land and on the islands of the sea, and all the acts of his power, his might, and the account of the greatness of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him, they're written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia. And Mordecai the Jew was second to King Ahasuerus, and was great among the Jews, and well received by the multitude of his brethren, seeking the good of his people, and speaking peace to all his countrymen. So what a difference where we start with a 6-month, 180-day party of sexism, misogyny, wickedness, corruption, a wicked man in power, the corruption that's in the land, and all the turn of events that leads ultimately, God turns it all around. And the book doesn't mention him. And I think that it's important for us, when we're living in a difficult time, Satan would want us to be focused on the evil and not focused on the Lord. He'd want us to become discouraged and think, well, what can I actually do? What good can I accomplish? Listen, who knows? But you're right where you are for such a time as this. Who knows how God might want to use you? Who knows what God might have planned? And we're obedient in what seems to be clearly the direction that God's giving us, with a lot of uncertainty. And we say, all right, Lord, this seems to be what you want to do. I'm going to do it. And with this uncertainty, I'll just live with uncertainty while I obey you. And we'll call it faith. Faith means I believe God enough, I'm going to do what he told me to do, even though I'm terrified. If you have to wait till you're not afraid, then I'll still be waiting. Now, your reading for next week is Job. So thank you, or you're welcome, I should say, for that. Here's how you read the book of Job. Very interesting first part. You're going to look and see how the difficulty that comes into his life, the root of it is not God, and the root of it is not Job. The root of it is who? It's the devil. The evil's coming. Evil's in the world. Job suffers tremendously, and it's very confusing to him. And yet he keeps his integrity, and then his friends come to visit. And the one good thing his friends do is not talk. It would have been better had they never talked. But they sit with him and don't talk for a few days, and then they start talking. And so when you start to read what his friends say, remember his friends are not speaking the truth. It's in the Bible, but not everything in the Bible is true. Okay, listen to me carefully. When the devil's talking in the Bible, it's probably a lie. And the devil's quoted in the Bible. When Job's friends are talking in the Bible, they're not representing God. They're representing different philosophies or views or ideas that people have about why good people suffer. So if you quote one of Job's friends and you say, hey, Rich, this verse says this. And I say, yeah, but who's talking? That's Job's friend who's spouting what he thinks is wisdom. But God's commentary at the end of the section that is his friends talking, God says, these guys don't know what they're talking about. So you want to read it knowing that they don't know what they're talking about. So as you read through it, say, what's this guy's point? This guy's making a point. It's poetic. It's going to dance around the story, and you're like, okay, what's he trying to say? What's the root of suffering? Why is suffering happening? That guy's point. Then the next guy talks, then the next guy talks. And the three guys each take a few turns talking. And then when they're done, a younger guy jumps in, and you'll like him at first. He seems to be making more sense, but even he gets off track. And when he's done, God talks. And Job responds to all of them and disagrees with them. And so that's this kind of philosophical debate going through between him and his friends. So sort of, you don't need to get stuck on it like you're reading Romans. Okay, Romans very clearly laid out argument by an inspired apostle. This is sort of a poetic look at the problem of suffering. So you can read it, use your speed reading techniques, just try to understand this guy's point is this guy's point is this, and you'll just see him say it over and over again. And then the really good part, though, is when God talks. You can read that part much more carefully. God's going to talk, and God's going to answer them. And try to see if you can summarize God's answer. Why does God say there's suffering? And does he give an answer? And if you think he gave an answer, what do you think it is? So kind of read it like that, and you'll have a good grasp of it. And we'll go over it next Sunday night, okay? So 42 chapters as you're reading this week. And most of it, God said, these guys don't know what they're talking about. Father, we thank you for your word. We pray you'd continue to speak to us through it and reveal yourself to us. And we thank you for Esther and her obedience, and Mordecai and his boldness, and the wisdom that's here, that he said, listen, God's going to work. God's going to do what God's going to do. And who knows, but maybe you're right where you're supposed to be. So help us, Lord, to be inspired by that, and to realize there's something that you might be doing we never even thought of. Even in her case, in Esther's case, in tremendous difficulty, she was able to overcome it somehow and still see God, no matter how much confusion was around her. And Lord, help us the same way to see you no matter how much confusion is around us. And we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.